Okay, I know I promised all my listeners more meditations on Peter Kreff's Everything You Wanted to Know About Heaven, but as a Catholic priest, I find it's important to share a few words about the latest from our Holy Father, Pope Francis. His last move as our Supreme Pontiff is to change the teaching on capital punishment. It's reported that he has declared capital punishment always wrong. Allow me to share at least a few questions. First, Holy Father, are you sure you can do that? I mean, I know you're Pope and everything, but changing a teaching that has been a part of our Catholic tradition since the beginning might be something even a Pope can't do. So that's the first thing. And this leads to a very important aspect of our Catholic faith, and especially our controversial teaching about the infallibility of the Pope. Of course, some folks, especially faithful Catholics, might say, of course he can do that. He's the Pope. He can do anything he wants. Unfortunately, that's not a good sign of the correct way to understand our controversial belief in papal infallibility. To believe he is infallible is not to believe that a Pope can't make a mistake, and it also means he cannot contradict a teaching that has been established by Scripture or sacred tradition. There is a rather important difference between what Cardinal John Newman called the development of doctrine and what can be described as a contradiction of a previous doctrine. But the next question that we need to ask is, what does an absolute prohibition on capital punishment do to the other Catholic teaching on a just war? The Catholic Church has from the beginning taught that it is possible to wage a just war. There's an important lesson from early Christian history, which I encourage all of us to consider when we think about the absolute prohibition on capital punishment. In the early Church, when Christians were faced with perhaps one of the most formidable anti-Catholic forces of all time, the pagan world of the Roman Empire, there was a dispute back then between St. Polycarp and Tertullian on the one side and the Montanists on the other side. Christians were being martyred, put to death by the state's use of capital punishment, as it were. And Christians of the time were understandably wondering what they should do in such a terrible situation. The Montanists insist Christians cannot fight. Jesus taught us to turn the other cheek, and therefore we should all turn the other cheek and submit to the state's use of capital punishment. In other words, the Montanists were saying there is no such thing as a just war. There are no circumstances when a true Christian can take up arms and go kill an enemy who is trying to destroy you. So what does this have to do with a prohibition against capital punishment? Well, if it is never right to kill a man or a woman who is a threat to society, then it is never right to kill soldiers who belong to an army that is a threat to society. I imagine the Pope would say, hey, killing someone on death row in a prison is much different than soldiers killing others on a battlefield. With our modern prisons, the right thing to do is always to keep them locked up for life. Fair enough, certainly many societies with modern prisons can keep societies safe from a dangerous murderer by keeping them locked up for life. But what if that person is locked up in a modern prison and he begins to murder other people locked up in the same prison? What if the only way to protect the other prisoners is to kill this murderous person? Wouldn't this be a justifiable use of capital punishment? And here's my last question, which I believe we need to consider while considering the morality of capital punishment. Is it true that some murderers kill from a motive of seeking fame? Is it true that such murderers, like those we see so often marching into a high school and shooting up the place, act in a copycat way? That means they have seen other mass murderers, school shooters as we now call them, and they see these guys get their 5 minutes of fame and are then hauled away to jail, presumably for the rest of their lives. If the copycat syndrome is true for mass murders, then is it not a good thing that school shooters sometimes be executed so as to reduce future copycat murders? To conclude then, let me quote from Father Hardin's The Catholic Catechism, page 374, regarding the Tertullian-Montanist dispute. Quote, Tertullian argued that Christians are called to become a substantial part of a nation. They should wish to bring, if at all possible, all its people to the faith. If this be true, then as citizens of the state, the faithful are obliged to serve the essential interests of the state, which at times will include military service. If Christians do not serve the state, Christianity will be reduced to a minority sect. If Christians refuse military service and then they take control of the government, they will create a Montanist-like state, which is doomed to be very short-lived. End quote. Obviously, a state faces enemies from other states and other forces. Likewise, it should be admitted that a state can face enemies from within. This is obviously the basis for the practice of executing traitors. And Lord knows that it is quite possible for the state to execute too many traitors, or to execute people who are not really trying to destroy the state, but in reality are trying to help the state. Consider all the Catholics executed in Elizabethan England. True enough. But also true is the possibility of a state correctly identifying certain individuals as true traitors, determined to destroy the state. When such true traitors become popular with others, the copycat syndrome kicks in again, and an absolute prohibition of capital punishment seems to be identical, if not very similar, to an absolute belief that there is no such thing as a just war. I'm Father Tom Koys. Be sure to click on my like button. God be with you.